Hi, fantasy readers. This is Karyne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. Today's story is a unique little Sleeping Beauty retelling that keeps you guessing about who did the cursing. It's written by Beka Gremikova, who has a million short stories out there between Havoc and her own anthologies. She lives, writes, and dreams from the Ottawa Valley in Ontario, Canada. Her passions include traveling, folklore and myth, and nerding out over anime, manga, and The Legend of Zelda. When she's not reading, writing, or drawing, she can be found climbing mountains and slaying monsters. In the virtual realm, of course. In real life, she prefers cuddling cute animals and eating delicious foods of all kinds. She will write in exchange for ramen. I always laugh when I say that word because when my husband and I were dating, we fought over whether it was pronounced ramen or ramen. And I'm happy to say that despite being notorious for mispronouncing words when recording the podcast, I was right about that one. Stick around to the end or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from Beka, as well as how to enter our massive audiobook giveaway. For now, please enjoy The Spindle Trap by Beka Gremikova. Today, Theron would curse her family. And today, she would save them. She closed the door of the tower room and slid the bolt in place, more out of habit than any real fear she'd be interrupted. The only people left in the palace were her parents, herself, and her loyal maid, Hilda. In celebration of Theron's momentous 16th birthday, which also happened to be the 16th anniversary of her fairy curse, she'd suggested the servants take the entire week off to spend time with their families. Her parents had complied, little suspecting it was all part of Theron's plan. Though a wicked fairy had cursed Theron to die by spindle touch on her 16th birthday, Lady Luce, both a family friend and a fairy, had altered the spell so that Theron and everyone else within the castle would slip into a century-long slumber instead. Theron intended to make great use of that sleeping spell now. However, there was no need to sweep the innocent servants into this insanity against their will. No, it was just her and Hilda now. The palace servants would live out their futures with their families, while Theron snatched at one last hope to save her own. If she failed, well, the kingdom would likely break apart if she failed. Theron swiped her suddenly sweaty fingers across her skirts and sucked in a deep breath before turning to survey the spacious chamber. She wouldn't fail. Not when she'd planned this out to every detail. Over the past 6 months, she'd slowly accrued everything needed for her 100-year sleep. Against one wall sat a 4-poster bed, complete with the softest mattress she could find, full of large, fluffy pillows. Not far from the bed nestled a cozy cot for Hilda, who had flatly refused anything grander. And most importantly, in the middle of the room, "You got the spinning wheel?" Theron breathed. Hilda, her unwilling yet loyal accomplice, grunted in response from her seat at the wheel. Adjusting her glasses across the bridge of her crooked nose, she frowned at Theron. "Do you know what it took to smuggle this in here?" She tapped gnarled fingers against one of the dark wooden spokes. "If the ministers find us, they won't." Theron had prepared for that, too. She strode over to the window and gazed out at the fields of golden wheat that stretched far off into the distance. "I sent them on a witch hunt for spinning wheels, all the way to Ildabar." From this vantage point, far away Ildabar, the floating city ruled by fairies and known for its giant magical swans, glimmered like diamond spangled clouds. In that distant city, Lady Luce would ensure that her part of Theron's plans went accordingly. Every last minister went? Hilda snorted. How did you convince them to do that? Theron leaned her elbows on the window ledge. Somehow, Hilda's incredulity settled her lingering nerves. Perhaps because adults were always disbelieving when it came to her ideas, and that normalcy helped make this incredible situation feel a little less insane. You know how they are. I told them I was getting more and more paranoid the closer we got to my birthday. They ate it up with a spoon and rushed off to save the day. Theron wasn't sure who she disliked more, the ministers or the baby cursing fairy responsible for the start of this mess. At least with the fairy curse, there seemed to be a positive side. Years ago, Theron's estranged uncle had been turned into a beast and had been showered with riches, honor, and sympathetic attention because of it. A dying king had even gifted her uncle with a kingdom of his own, simply out of pity. No wonder her parents didn't talk to him anymore. Not that they talked to each other much, either. Those ministers would scale mountains to get on your good side, I think, Hilda grumbled. There's only one way to get on my good side right now, Theron muttered, scowling out at the rippling wheat fields. And none of them are willing to do that. No, the ministers would not back down from approving her father's decision to break from his marriage to Theron's mother. Theron even suspected they may have planted the terrible idea in her father's mind, though she couldn't fathom why they would do such a thing. All she knew was that 6 months ago, she overheard her parents arguing between themselves, before arguing with the ministers. Then the parade of paperwork and divorce proceedings had begun. When she'd broached the subject with the head minister of castle affairs, he'd merely given her a pitying glance and told her not to worry about anything, that she'd be taken care of. Theron gritted her teeth. This was about far more than just her. Scuffing echoed, and Theron turned her head to see Hilda sidling up behind her. The older woman pressed a gentle hand to Theron's back, as comforting as a mother's touch. When she spoke next, her tone was soft. Theron, she murmured, are you certain about this? The ministers may have had their reasons. Perhaps you're too far from the situation to understand the context. Theron lifted her chin so it wouldn't tremble, blinking back a sudden sting of tears. Then they should have told me what those reasons were, she said, when she could finally speak. And perhaps they're too close to the situation to understand the consequences. It wasn't fair of them to act as though she was only a child, as though she couldn't understand. Because she understood far too much. She understood that her mother always said to do what was best for the kingdom, and Theron could picture all too well the strife that her parents' divorce might cause. Nobles would take sides, currency would have to be altered, and who knew what would happen to foreign relations with other nations. This land had flourished under her parents' care, and now it was Theron's turn to protect what they had built. To be the leader they'd raised her to be, no matter how many ministers stood in her way. So the ministers had to go. Not that Theron's plans had veered into assassination territory. She was well connected, but only to fairies who found violence distasteful, a sentiment she somewhat agreed with. Hence, she'd decided that the distance of a century would work just as well to sweep her family away from the malignant forces intent on destroying it. When they woke up next, they'd have a brand new start. A chill breeze swept off the fields, blasting Theron in the face. With a shiver, she shuffled away from the window and wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Well? She asked Hilda, who merely gazed at her silently, her thin lips turned down. Any more questions for me? Or, if you continue to doubt, perhaps you'd like to demand an explanation from my parents? Hilda sucked in her cheeks. She knew as well as Theron that such a thing would not go smoothly. That's what I thought. Theron rubbed her hands together and nibbled on her bottom lip. Hilda opened her mouth, then seemed to think better of what she'd been about to say. Instead, she crossed her arms, tilting her head. Are you nervous about what comes after? She asked, raising her eyebrows. This was an entirely different kind of distress. Warmth prickled across Theron's face, and she quickly turned from Hilda to study the spinning wheel with its mass of spokes and shining spindle. She reached out and yanked her hand back. You mean the kiss? To her horror, her voice squeaked on the last word. How was it she could plot so confidently to rescue her family from their own court's machinations? But when it came to boys, she was so utterly at a loss. Hilda hummed in response. Are you certain Lady Luce received your notes? Breaking a curse or no, I don't want just any young man traipsing into this castle. Theron straightened, plucking at the frayed hem of her shawl. Lady Luce wrote to me herself to tell me she'd received my orders. She says she'll find a nice prince and ask him the list of questions I sent her before she allows anyone to wake me. If the prince couldn't pass Theron's interview, she didn't want him anywhere close to her lips. Hilda still didn't seem convinced. She sniffed and crossed over to the bed, fluffing the pillows with a vengeance. That fairy had better do her job well, she grumbled. The maid's obvious show of protective maternal affection made Theron want to throw her arms around Hilda. But she restrained herself, suddenly reminded of Hilda's own sacrifice to be here. Hilda, before I continue, are you sure you wish to come along? Your children are out there. Theron bit her lip. In her letter to Lady Luce, she'd also entrusted her kingdom and all its inhabitants into Ildebar's care while she and her parents slept. But it seemed a hollow comfort when her maid would never get to see her family cared for herself. For the first time, her loyal servant seemed to waver, her eyes watering. And my grandchildren, Hilda murmured. She stared down at the tangle of blankets on the bed, a pillow dangling from her fingers. But they understand why I have chosen to accompany you. A mother longs to protect all her children, whether they are bound to her by blood or soul. This time, Theron couldn't stop herself. Lips wobbling, eyes stinging, she wrapped her arms around Hilda's waist and squeezed. I know you don't entirely agree with my methods, Hilda, but thank you. The older woman shifted so she could pat Theron's cheek. I have no wish for your parents to split either, she murmured. I have known your father since he was just a boy, and to see this happen. A deep sigh slipped from her, and Theron felt it echo in her own bones. She gave the maid one last hug. It won't have to happen, Hilda. You'll see. Stepping away from the bed, Theron strode over to the spinning wheel. For a moment, she simply stood there, steeling herself. One touch, and she'd alter history forever. When she woke up, she'd be on the other side of a century. She would forge a better future for those she loved, away from prying eyes and meddlesome mouths. There was no way her plan could go wrong. It couldn't go wrong, not when an entire nation was at stake, not when her family was at stake. Theron stretched out her hand, stopping just short of the spindle. I think I'm ready now, Hilda. Hilda hurried over, her arms outstretched to catch Theron when she fell. At least, that was the hope. Lady Luce hadn't been quite sure how quickly the sleeping spell would set in for the other occupants of the palace. Sweet dreams, my dear, Hilda murmured from behind her. Theron pressed her finger against the spindle. Though the point didn't even break her skin, the hazy fog of magic crept over her body, seeping into her limbs. Theron yawned, her eyelids fluttering. She staggered backwards into Hilda's waiting arms, and the maid helped her over to the bed. Theron crawled under the blankets and hugged a pillow to her chest. Through blurring vision, she watched Hilda sink onto her own cot, covering a yawn with a hand. Another breeze snuck through the window to buffet Theron's face, and she caught the crisp scent of autumn air before sleep took her over completely. If the magic that put her to sleep had been like fog, the magic that ripped her from it felt like a poke. Theron jolted upright to find the young, startled face of a prince very close to hers. At least, she assumed he was a prince from the thin silver band atop his white blonde hair. The prince jerked back, his dark eyes widening. It worked! His voice came out slightly higher pitched than she'd expected. He couldn't have been much older than her then. He cleared his throat, his face reddening in a way that made the freckles speckling his nose and cheeks pop. He was rather adorable. Before she could allow that thought to sink in and fluster her, she pushed it aside. Instead, with more serenity than she felt, she said, "Of course it did," before rubbing her eyes and shaking out her long black hair. She didn't want to meet her parents looking sloppy. "You seem rather calm about being kissed by a stranger." She tossed back the blankets and speared him with a questioning look. "You did receive my note from Lady Luce, didn't you?" The poor boy stared down at his hands, his face growing even darker red. "Yes, the fairy. She asked me questions and gave me a note. It it said I had your permission to." He swallowed and waved at her. "To kiss you." His discomfort with the whole situation assured Theron that, so far at least, her plan was going smoothly. If this was a portent of what was to come, "Yes, that's all fine," she said, giddiness welling up inside her. "I decided that if I had to be kissed by a stranger, it must be someone I found worthy. Better a prince with a sense of propriety and manners than one who thought he could take whatever he wanted without consequences." The prince scratched at his neck, then adjusted his well-worn tunic and cleared his throat once more. Well, please excuse my forwardness, anyways. My name is Prince Edvin of Ildabar. Ildabar? Her heart quickened. So you and your family have been looking after our kingdom for us, then? Edvin wandered over to the window, brushing off the thick layer of dust from the ledge. Theron rose to follow him, and grimaced as pain stabbed at her joints. It took her far too long to hobble across the room and join him. "We've tried our best," he said with a sigh. "I suppose you and your parents will take over again?" Theron peeked over his shoulder. To her surprise, not much seemed to have changed in a century, except Ildabar looked much closer now. It hovered over the wheat fields, while giant swans carried people back and forth from the sky. She almost fancied she could hear the whoosh of the creature's wings. "That is the hope," Theron murmured, riveted to the scene before her. She'd never visited Ildabar herself, had never seen it so close. How much else could change, or stay the same, in 100 years? Edvin sidled away from the window, fidgeting with the colorful tassels on his sleeves. Um, Forgive me, but I don't really know the proper next step. I've never rescued a princess before. Am I supposed to He seemed to choke on the word. Propose now? Not so fast, little sir, a groggy voice muttered from nearby. Edvin started and whirled around. Theron grinned as Hilda stretched and cracked her knuckles, somehow still looking sharp, despite the sleepy glaze to her eyes. "Good morning, Hilda dear." Theron wandered over to kiss her maid on the cheek. Hilda crooked a finger at the prince to beckon him closer. "Have you seen your parents yet?" she asked Theron. "I'm on my way right now." Theron turned to Edvin with an encouraging smile. "Hilda just wants to make sure she approves of you before we continue with any official betrothal business. We can discuss the next steps later on." Once they sat down with her parents and she could get their opinions. She bit back a giddy grin. She couldn't wait to see them without the ministers there to poke their noses in business that was none of their concern. Hilda gestured to the spinning wheel's stool, and Edvin sat down, shooting Theron a pleading glance. Theron patted his shoulder on her way to the door. "She won't bite you, I promise. Meet me at the throne room when you're done, and then we'll find something to eat while we chat." The day had already started marvelously, and the idea of food only added a skip to Theron's step as she slipped out into the hallway, down the curving staircase, and into the silent castle. It felt strange to walk the halls, knowing that everyone who once worked within them had died. They'd stayed with their families, worked the fields, grown old, had a new generation take their place. She blinked back a wave of odd dizziness. If she thought too long on it, she'd muddle her mind. She had to focus on the reason why she'd done this in the first place. Her parents were in the throne room, slumped, sleeping at a paper-strewn desk. Theron's heart leapt at the sight of them, and she quickened her pace. As she approached, her mother sat up first, blinking and yawning. She stared at Theron, brow furrowed. "Theron? What day is it? It's still your birthday? We didn't miss it?" Theron swallowed a laugh. "Well, maybe by 100 years, but it's all right." Her mother's face paled, and she shot to her feet. The the curse? It came to pass?" But Theron was staring down at the papers on the table. A chill curled down her spine as she read the official legal headings. You were discussing your divorce on my birthday? Her mother bit her lip. The ministers were rather insistent. She trailed off as Theron's father shifted and stretched. Oh, bother the ministers! Theron wrapped her arms around her mother's shoulders, burying her face in the queen's soft, dark hair. They can't hurt you now. It made her queasy to see her calm, controlled mother so nervous. Hurt her? Her father's voice, slightly groggy yet still sharp, broke in. You needn't worry about that. Theron bristled. Well, I did worry, she snapped. You can't just put away the queen because the ministers say so. They don't run this country. Her mother flinched, and she stepped away from her daughter. The king stared blankly back at Theron, his gaze reticent. You don't understand, Theron. His green eyes flicked to the queen, and his lips curled slightly. Let us handle this. Don't concern yourself. Don't concern herself? Over matters of her own family? As if she were some stranger with no stakes in how this played out? Theron stretched out her hands. You don't understand. I handled this. Who do you think invoked the curse? Her mother wobbled. You brought the curse down on us? On purpose? She stumbled a few steps and braced herself against the table, rattling the inkwells. The king started to laugh, his craggy features scrunching as he doubled over, clutching his stomach. What was going on? Theron backed away, glancing at her mother for answers, but the queen stood stone-faced, her shoulders hunched. Gone was the sure, regal woman Theron had always known. Her mother looked guilty. She's just like you, the king gasped as he wiped his eyes. Can't leave a curse alone. He grew somber, and his voice went cold. Go on, Theron. Ask your mother the truth behind your curse. Chills skittered up Theron's arms. She tugged her shawl tighter as her mind raced. What truth? What had been kept from her? What element had she completely missed in her careful planning? She turned to the queen. Her mother didn't flinch, though her eyes gleamed softly. I suppose if I don't tell you, he will. She wants answers so badly. Might as well give her the real ones. The king's voice broke on the last word. He stared at the queen as though he were assessing an enemy he'd once loved and trusted. The queen sucked in a breath. I asked the fairy to curse you. Words strangled in Theron's throat. She swallowed them down and tried again. Her voice came out as a croak. What? Oh, it wasn't supposed to be a killing curse, but she hired the wrong witch, her father said flatly. This was all too much even for Theron's brain. Her knees buckled, and she crumpled. A pair of unfamiliar arms caught her, and she found herself pressed against someone's chest. Pardon me, Edvin's voice murmured in her ear. She could only lift her head and nod. She turned her attention back to her parents, desperate for answers, anything to explain the pain tearing into her soul. The room seemed to spin, and she shook her head to clear the fog. Why? She asked finally. How could this be happening? She'd had everything planned so perfectly. Perhaps you're too far from the situation to understand the context. Hilda's voice slid through her thoughts. Theron didn't think her maid had known, but perhaps she'd suspected the truth would be far darker than Theron was prepared to accept. Even before his curse, your uncle always outshone your father, though he'd done nothing to deserve it. He wasn't even the crown prince. When he was turned into a beast, everyone flocked to him and his ridiculous sob story. Riches, honor, fame, an entire kingdom, all for a prince who spent more time arguing about politics than doing anything to fix problems. If I had magic, I'd have cursed him too. The queen paced, her face flushed. Because of his curse, his new kingdom flourished. I just wanted to give our nation the same attention and honor. I wanted a king who deserved it to bask in those rewards. She turned to Theron, her arms outstretched, her eyes wide and pleading. Surely you understand. Haven't I always taught you to do what's best for the kingdom? Was this why their land had always been so well cared for? Not because her parents had done good work, but because their coffers had been filled with sympathy gifts for having a cursed daughter? Not because they'd truly been better than her uncle, but because they had believed themselves to be? Not because they'd used their talents for the benefit of their citizens, but because they'd used her? So, you asked the fairy to curse me? The family she'd fought for, the family she'd longed to protect. Had they even been worth saving? Hilda had given up a life with her children and grandchildren. For this? Can you blame me for being angry? The king's nostrils flared. I just found out 6 months ago. I mean, 6 months before your 16th birthday. He glared down at the papers in front of him. The ministers were only putting my orders into motion. Theron's vision blurred. She'd had it all wrong, the entire time. Edvin shifted his stance behind her, sucked in a breath as though he were about to say something. She grabbed his arm, which was still wrapped around her waist in support, and squeezed. She gave the slightest shake of her head and hoped he understood the message. He sighed, but the tension did not ease from him. Her parents seemed to notice the prince for the first time. Who's this? Her father demanded. The prince who woke me, Theron said when she could speak without letting a sob escape. Edvin of Ildabar. Her mother's eyes narrowed. I don't think he should be privy to any more of this discussion. Fresh air sounds lovely, Edvin said coldly. Theron stiffened in surprise at his tone. If she'd join me, the prince continued, I would like to invite the princess for a turn around the gardens. We can leave you to discuss your proceedings in the secrecy you desire. I'll go with him, she blurted, before her parents could answer. The king and queen exchanged a glance, and in unison nodded. Theron barely felt Edvin half carry, half drag her outdoors, where a soft autumn breeze brushed against the tears on her cheeks. He helped her sit on a stone bench just outside the palace gates. I'm so sorry, he whispered. She wiped her eyes. She felt like a court jester, an absolute fool. For once, She had no answers, no confident reply. She leaned over, gripping the edge of the bench. I. I don't know what to do, what to say. This world felt strange to her, menacing. It wasn't the future she'd concocted. I hope I didn't step out of line back there. He edged a bit closer on the bench, near enough to comfort without invading her space. She choked on a laugh. I think that's the least of my worries at the moment. Etiquette is apparently not my family's strong suit. After all, what could be crueler than cursing one's own child for the sake of power and money? And both of her parents had treated their divorce as though it was something that didn't affect her, something that she was too childish to understand. Which perhaps she was, but only because they hadn't sat her down to explain what was truly going on, because they hadn't given her the chance to make an adult, informed decision about how their actions would shape hers. She was glad her back was to the castle. Right now, she didn't want to acknowledge its existence. Heat writhed within her, fiery wrath toward her mother for everything she'd done, and a sputtering resentment and sadness that her father had barred her from understanding the truth until it was too late. Edvin stared into the distance, his hands clasped between his knees. His mouth was turned down, his brow furrowed deeply. He sighed again and tore his fingers through his hair. Talk about etiquette. Theron hadn't even thanked him for his assistance. Thank you for helping me, she whispered. You've been very kind. He scratched his cheek, lips pursed. A tinge of red returned to his skin. I I wish I could do more. He swallowed. I I know we hardly know each other, but if you wish, if you need it, my castle is open to you. Our countries have been allies for so long. I'm sure my parents would be happy to help you until you can decide what to do next. Despite her wretchedness, she couldn't help asking, Are you inviting me to elope? His entire face turned scarlet. Not yet. I mean, of course not. My mother would kill me. He coughed and rubbed his face, which only drew her attention to his freckles. His scattered reply helped alleviate some of her gnawing anger, reminded her that not all was quite lost in this future. Your mother, is she like you? She asked. Edvin dug the toe of his riding boot into the dirt. Somewhat. More confident, I suppose. But that's what ruling Ildabar for the last 15 years will do to you. You have to have confidence to keep all those fairies in order. He smiled ruefully. I think she'd be thrilled to have another princess in the castle. She had all boys. It can be very chaotic. She seems to have raised you well, at least. Better than Theron's parents had raised her. A loud, boisterous castle sounded soothing in comparison to the suffocating secrets behind them. I'd love to accompany you. His eyes lit up, and then he chewed at his bottom lip. Oh, will that be all right? You're the heir. I think my parents will understand why I might want to leave. At least, for a time. Until she could look at them again, without thorns of rage piercing her heart. Until she could look at them again and remember they were her parents, and not her enemies. She stood, smoothing out her skirts. Might I bring Hilda along? Theron winced to think of what Hilda might say once she learned what had happened in the throne room. She didn't know what she could say to the loyal maid who'd given up so much to be with her. How to explain that the future they'd sacrificed for wasn't meant to be. Of course. Is there anything else you'll need? He tapped his boot against the path. I'd rather not linger too long here. He shuddered. Theron couldn't blame him. She didn't really want to be around her parents anymore either. She stepped toward the castle. I'll go pack a few clothes and find Hilda. She hesitated. Thank you again. This couldn't be what you expected to find. He shrugged. It's the least I could do. Her eyes stung. What would everyone say when they reached Ildebar? Would the fairy court call her a fool for going to all this trouble for nothing? What would Lady Luce say? Edvin touched her arm. Would you like me to come with you? She blinked at him a few times before she realized he thought she was nervous to return to her castle. What a dear. At least, no matter what she faced next, she had Edvin there with her as a friend and ally. Maybe with someone like him around, they could keep her nation from falling apart completely. It's all right, she whispered. I'll meet you back out here. And then she'd face the future she hadn't planned. A future that couldn't be controlled by a spindle trap. But when she pictured her parents at each other's throats in the throne room, she realized there really were worse fates than that. I hope you enjoyed listening to The Spindle Trap by Beka Gremikova, narrated by Karyne Norton. If you want to read more by Beka, go to bekagremikova.com to find more of her books. I will also have a direct link in the show notes where you can snag her free short story, The Mermaid's Soul, which is a fun Little Mermaid retelling. Don't forget about this month's giveaway with classic epic fantasy audiobooks, including Lord of the Rings, Narnia, and one each from Sullivan and Sanderson, as well as a 3-month Audible membership. Go to findingfantasyreads.com/giveaway to enter. Just a reminder, we have one more episode next week before we pause for the summer, but I promise we will pick back up again on August 6th with new episodes. I will still be using that time to find more stories, so this is a fantastic time to apply for the podcast if you have a short story you want shared, or to suggest an author if you have someone you want me to feature. You can make suggestions and apply on the podcast contact page, and I'll have a direct link for it in the show notes, along with the giveaway and Beka's website. Next week, I will also be putting up the Google form for everyone to be able to place their vote for the Finding Fantasy Reads Listener's Choice Award. You will have 1 week to fill that out, and then I will be announcing the winners in June. I'm excited to see who you all choose. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.